Okay, come here. Come here.
Why, hello everyone. Happy Wednesday to all of you. Today's beverage of choice is not water. Today's beverage of choice is blue raspberry lemonade Kool-Aid. So yes, I still drink like a child, but it is sweetened with Splenda for anyone who cares about such things. It's funny how having to be at home leads to having to develop different coping skills than when we're at school all day. And so apparently for me, one of them has been drinking Kool-Aid again, which I found I tremendously enjoy. So how are things going with y'all? I'll wait here for a second. So far, there's 5 of you. Can y'all Biscuit? Okay. Good, John. So today is probably going to be a shorter day. Just finished eating. Pretty good. Just woke up. Okay. Making the most of not having to be in class. All right, Liza, what'd you have to eat? Pretty boring, Dominic, but still good. Okay. Things are all right. Still have a job. Very good, Isabella. Maddie, good. Justin, tired. I respect that. Are you one of the people, Justin, staying up till like 5 a.m? Oatmeal and noodles together? Janelle, same old. Homework most of the time. Okay. Justin. Yeah. Okay, I told y'all last video, don't stay up till 5 a.m. That's just not good. Brittany, I'm sorry, Brittany, but I'm impressed that you shot up so quickly. That these videos, they're live, but then they're posted after this. So if you forget, that's okay. But you're encouraged to leave comments on the video or send me an email. Anyway, oh yeah, Eliza, your stomach is gonna feel it. Okay. All right. So, are there any questions about Kat still at work? Just going to class at work. Are there any questions about the Marx stuff that we covered on Monday? I know we covered like a lot of information, and before I move on, I want to make sure if there are questions that I'm able to address them. Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. So if you didn't catch my little thumbnail that I made, the person we're going to talk about today is Emile Durkheim, and his name is not Emile, even though most people read his name as Emily. It is Emile, and so he's a sociologist. And here, let me make sure I have all the information here about him that I want to tell you. Oh yeah, okay. So he was born in 1858 in Epinal, which is on the French-German border. Okay. And he comes from 7 generations of rabbis. So his dad is a rabbi, his grandpa's a rabbi, great-grandpa's a rabbi. I mean, coming from like an extremely religious and an observant household. So it's really important when you read Durkheim and when you try to understand Durkheim, you cannot forget the fact that he comes from this long generation of rabbis. His moral concerns come from the fact that his dad was a rabbi. And in fact, his dad and his family wanted him to be a rabbi. But when he was a teenager, he kind of told his dad, hey, I really don't think I want to be a rabbi. His dad was like, well, I'm okay with that. But whatever it is that you pursue, I want you to pursue it to the fullest. And so Durkheim, after taking multiple college admissions tests, like their version of the SAT, gets into the best university in France. And he's part of a class of French intellectuals that would go on to make a tremendous difference in terms of 19th century academic life. The other one, Henri Bergson, I'm not really going to talk about him, but you'll hear about him later in your college career. So he was in Durkheim's class, and he studied philosophy, which is funny because he's depending on who you take for anthropology, he's one of the fathers of sociology, one of the fathers of anthropology, one of the fathers of social science. So he's a tremendously influential guy, even though he actually came originally out of philosophy. Now, what's cool about Durkheim is when he finishes his graduate work, or while I guess he goes to graduate school, he's taking the classes in philosophy, and then he decides to go study in Germany. And when he's in Germany, he studies with a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. It looks like Wilhelm Wundt. And Wundt was well known to Freud as well, and he was an experimental psychologist in Germany. And it was from Wundt that Durkheim developed an interest in social science, including the scientific method applied to studying people, which obviously has all sorts of problems associated with it. But Durkheim was aware of those. He was a very intellectually honest guy. And so he wanted to found the discipline of sociology on more stable ground than Comte did. So there's two different guys here. I'll write it down for you. So there's Kant. I don't think you're going to be able to see this. Can you see this? Kant. No, you can't read that. Okay, Kant with a K, K-A-N-T. He's a German philosopher. And then there's Comte, which is a French philosopher, C-O-M-T-E. And Comte founded sociology, and then he went insane and died, and basically sociology died with him. And so Durkheim comes after him, and he works to yep, there you go, Kaylee, perfect, thank you very much. They so he works to refound the discipline on more stable ground, so to speak. So yeah, that was Durkheim's primary concern. So he comes back from Germany, and one other thing about Germany. So he studied with Wundt, and then he also had the opportunity to go to a lot of these different philosophy conferences. And the philosopher at the time who was most popular was a guy named Arthur Schopenhauer. And if you haven't heard of Schopenhauer, he's tremendously fun to read because he's probably the angriest guy who's ever lived in the entire world. In fact, his nickname is the Great Pessimist, and or the Buddha of Frankfurt, because he kind of brings together Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. It brings together like kind of early Christian thought and Platonism with the thought of Kant with K, as Kaylee pointed out, and then Buddhism and Hinduism. So he's a really interesting guy, and he brings all of this together, but he's extremely pessimistic. And Durkheim gets super into the Schopenhauer thing. So he goes back from Germany to France. And he writes his doctoral dissertation, which is called The Division of Labor in Society. And that's where the excerpt that we read for this class comes from. And Durkheim, in that book, basically lays out how the division of labor works within society itself, but how the division of labor is just a part of existence. Like you can't have existence without it. And so he gives this really interesting example. And so here I'll explain the whole thing for you because I think it's like super cool. He says, if you look at the smallest unit that we can think of, he would say it's like the cell, the smallest organic entity that we can think of. So you can talk about, molecules or whatever, that's a different thing. But we're talking about organic life. And so smallest unit of organic life is the cell. And he says, if you look inside of a cell has a division of labor, right? And you've got mitochondria, and you've got ribosomes, and you've got a cell wall, and you've got all this different stuff. And so even within that tiny unit, there's specialization. There is a desire for people for the entities in the cell to do different things. And you go up from the cell, and you look at cells in general. And of course, cells are specialized too. You've got brain cells and skin cells and stem cells and bone cells and everything else, right? So you've got this unbelievable specialization. So we go up from cells, and what do we get? We get organs and tissues, and of course, your heart isn't your brain, and your brain isn't your liver, and your liver isn't your legs, and your legs aren't your arms, and your gallbladder is not the same thing as your kidneys. They're all different, and they all work together. And so again, even within your body, there is a specialization, a division of labor. And so Durkheim starts with this tiniest unit, okay, the cell, and he builds up from there to this understanding that society is composed of this tremendous division of labor. Okay, now you have to. So he takes that from Darwin, and he's going to build that Darwin with Schopenhauer. And he's going to hold these two things, which are kind of in tension. He's going to hold them together with his knowledge of and his appreciation of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay, so again, 7 generations of rabbis. You cannot discount this when you're reading Durkheim. And so Durkheim draws on his appreciation for the writings, especially of medieval theologians like Maimonides, okay, who's a Jewish philosopher, and then people like Thomas Aquinas. And so he's going to take those people, and he's going to use their ideas to hold this tension between Darwin and Schopenhauer together. Okay, so these ideas are kind of like at odds with one another, and Durkheim's going to hold them together using that. Now, one of the most interesting articles that I've read recently is actually an article published by a French sociologist, and they were able to obtain copies of Durkheim's library records. So imagine this. So he's dead, right? He dies in 1917. That's right. And we're able to get a copy of his library records from when he was working at the Sorbonne. So what we found about his records is that there were 2 books that he took out over everything else. Okay, so like you look at absolutely everything that he took out, and there were 2 books that he took out more than anything else. And the first one is Plato's Republic, okay, and the second one is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So what's so interesting about this is here's this guy who is working in creating sociology, who's concerned with morality, who doesn't particularly love philosophy, even though that's what he studied. And the 2 books that he's always measuring himself against, the 2 books he's drawing on the most, are 2 books written 2300 years ago. And so when we were talking about those the Greek guys, which we've talked about in class before, and I talk about how they're still relevant. I'm not the only person to think this. I'm not the only person to think that they had really profound ideas. Durkheim thought the same thing. In fact, it was Durkheim that got me interested in them. So, that was a lot. But what can I say? What else can I say about this? So throughout Durkheim, we find this intense concern with morality. We find this intense concern for how people are supposed to live together, how people are supposed to thrive, how people are supposed to be successful. But because he's drawing from Schopenhauer, he's extremely pessimistic. And so Durkheim observes something in his own time period, which is really interesting. He notices that religion has begun to lose its sway. So religion was this extremely powerful force, and he was in France, and so that's obviously a Catholic country, and the power of Catholicism over the French imagination, and also the various Protestant denominations that were big in France, like the Huguenots, for example, and the Calvinists. So they were losing prestige. They became less important in terms of the public consciousness and the public imagination. And so Durkheim sees this as like a vacating people's sense of morality. And it's not because Durkheim thinks that you can't be moral if you don't have religion. He doesn't equate religion with being good, because Durkheim is one of the first people to point out that religion, it can make us behave better, but religion can also push us to do things that are horrible. And Durkheim's very, very clear about this, and it's a really important contribution and an interesting one. So Durkheim would have no problem with the idea that atheists can be moral. And in fact, Durkheim, that's the biggest question of his sociology, is how is society supposed to be moral? How are people in society supposed to be good when the things that traditionally have told them how to behave are losing their power and are losing their sway? So I'm going to pause for a second. I said an awful lot. Any questions? You're going to say hi? So my wife wants to say hi to everyone.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet y'all.
So that's Katie. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was my wife. Where was I? Okay, yeah. So any questions so far about the Durkheim stuff? Y'all are so funny. Katie, everyone said hi. She says hi back. Okay. Yes, she is really pretty. People always say that whenever they see a picture of my wife. They're always like, "Oh, wow, your wife is so pretty." Did you just assume that that I wasn't going to have a pretty wife? You know. Anyway, I'll whatever. We'll leave it alone for now. So, okay, the Durkheim stuff. Okay, so the last thing I'll say about this is concern for morality. Is he sees, and he's in this long tradition, which comes out of this the writings of the Jewish philosophers and the Christian philosophers. This idea that without rules, people are basically limitless, that they will continue to do things, continue to push boundaries, and that without boundaries, that they're basically forced to, before which they're forced to bow, they will continue to kind of spin out of control. And so one of the things that is interesting about this is, right now we're dealing with COVID-19. And so for the most part, all of us are working from home, or we're spending a lot of time at home. And so now the problem is, are you going to hop online and listen to a lecture? Well, y'all are, so y'all are doing great. But also just being home all the time, it's like, you go to bed at 5 a.m. and you find it hard to wake up, and you find it hard to be motivated. And when you put all of those things together, it's really interesting, because it's like, well, now you're home. You don't have to like struggle to go to school all the time. Are you happier? And I bet for a lot of you, the answer is no, because part of being happy and part of feeling fulfilled is that struggle, that the pushback. And so when you remove those things and you remove those restraints, a lot of times things can get difficult, and the way we process things gets difficult. So Durkheim keenly understood this. Okay, so now I want to go to the reading real quick. Oh, yeah, I had one more thing I wanted to say about him. So by the way, all of the little fun facts about him, they're in the video, but there's a PowerPoint on Blackboard. It's called Foundations of Social Science, and some of what I say is on there. And so that's where you can get a lot of the information that's going to be like on the exam. Anyway, so let me think. Oh, the last thing. So Durkheim, how do I explain this? Okay. So during the time that Durkheim was working, there was this discussion about whether society is an organism or not. Is it metaphorically an organism? Is it like an organism? Or is it actually an organism? And students have been asking me ever since I started teaching, what is the difference between saying something is like an organism and saying it is an organism? And so here's my example. What is the difference between saying that someone is like your friend or that someone is your friend? I feel like those are extremely different categories for people to be in. And that's the same kind of thing that Durkheim's up to here. So Durkheim says, society is an organism. There's no if and or buts about it for Durkheim. Society 100% is an organism. And social institutions, so that would be things like the economy, the family, school, religion, the economy, and then you would have other parts, smaller institutions, things like specific denominations and churches, political organizations, community organizations, things like what is it? Tocqueville calls it the little platoons, I think or is that Burke? I don't know. Anyway, little platoon type things, little societies and organizations that hold people together. And so all of these things, they are all interrelated. They're all interconnected. And that's what society is made up. That is the fabric of society. It's all interconnected intimately. And it's a division of labor. And I guess the smallest unit would be the family for Durkheim, but you could also talk about society in terms of individuals, although Durkheim probably wouldn't go quite that far because he was more interested in social behavior rather than just simply individual behavior. But he did make this really interesting argument about individuals. He said we carry society with us everywhere that we go, so that once we have been socialized, which is to say raised in any type of social environment, everywhere we go henceforth we carry society with us. And so he talks about Even a hermit, like someone who lives out in the woods with animals, has an obligation to treat animals a certain way and to treat themselves a certain way, because they carry the values of society with them, and so therefore there's a right and a wrong way to treat oneself and to treat animals and to live in accord with nature. So that's really interesting about Durkheim. I think that was a pretty lengthy introduction, but he's got a super cool life and a super interesting guy. He was a great writer, very irascible. He really loved the Schopenhauer. He wasn't as like witty as Schopenhauer, and he also wasn't quite as pessimistic as Schopenhauer, I don't think. But man, he is a great polemicist. I mean, he is a fighter through and through. And so we'll see some of that today in the readings. Okay, so I don't know if you already looked at the reading, but it's real short. It's so I'm actually probably going to read the whole thing, and I'll kind of pause and give you examples. So I actually think the best way to read this little portion is to not start with the first page. If you're following along, it's Anomie and the Modern Division of Labor, and it's on page 62 if you're looking at our book, which again is Social Theory, the Multicultural, Global, and Classic Readings by Charles Limmer. Okay, so I actually think it's easier if we start over on the second page, and it's only like 2 pages long. Okay, so Durkheim says, nothing is falser than this antagonism too often presented between legal authority and individual liberty. So he's saying people have been arguing that there is a tension between legal authority, like the law, and individual authority. And Durkheim says, quite on the contrary, liberty, we mean genuine liberty, which it is society's duty to have respected, is itself the product of regulation. In other words, you cannot have liberty without regulation. He says, I can be free only to the extent that others are forbidden to profit from their physical, economic, or other superiority to the detriment of my liberty. But only social rules can prevent abuses of power. It is now known what complicated regulation is needed to assure individuals the economic independence without which their liberty is only nominal. So for a lot of history, people talked about economics as a zero-sum game. So basically it was like, this is all the wealth in the entire world. And no matter what's going on, no matter how societies are interacting with one another, when they fight and someone loses, you get a bigger piece of the pie. There's still only this much. They hadn't worked out yet that wealth can actually be created. And at the time they thought that it was zero sum. Okay, so there was only like so much of it in the world, and that was all you could do about it. Sorry, I lost y'all here. Okay, y'all are back. Here we go. So Durkheim is saying no. The only way you can really have liberty is if you have laws that keep people from infringing on your rights. Okay, and that's a really interesting distinction. So even if people want to maximize their profit, say their obligation to you, like the fact that they have to offer you a good price, or they have to pay you wages that are consummate with the market, those are all senses of obligation that we feel and that we have to other people. And so Durkheim says that without laws that force us to behave in a certain way towards people, we really can't have liberty. So it's interesting because, of course, y'all are building your own little societies right now. And I told y'all that you had to pick anarchist as the base. I didn't say you have to be an anarchist, but I said you had to start there. And there's a really interesting reason why anarchists have the highest personal economic, political, and social freedom in nation states, and that's because you can do whatever you want. But you could also make the argument that people have the least amount of freedom, especially in Durkheim's sense, in that kind of a society, because the highest moral law is the law of the strongest. Like whoever has the most power, whoever has the biggest stick, so to speak, is able to make people do what they want. So without a law that makes people that forces people to obey, then that is the highest law, basically. So when we get away from this law of the strongest, it's by having a law that is applied to all people. And Durkheim saw that highest law as kind of coming from religion, and once religion begins to lose its sway, then he becomes very concerned, like what's going to happen, and where is this new sense of central moral authority going to come from? And again, he thinks it's going to happen, but he's just not sure yet. And of course, he dies in 1917. That's during World War I, and of course, so he didn't live to see World War II. It's really kind of amazing when you read Durkheim and then you study 20th century history. I mean, seriously, once you remove moral restraints, you end up with a lot of horrible things. Stalin and Hitler justified what they did both on the bases of trying to carry out their particular social program. When there is nothing to stop you from just enforcing your ideas. Hey, Jalen, is that a wave or a high five? I don't know. Without an authority to kind of clamp down on you and say, your idea can't progress further than this, or your plan can't progress further than this, things can certainly go awry. So I'm going to pause here for a second. And questions so far? Okay. I'm having fun. Are y'all having fun? This is good stuff to talk about. And all the people we're going to talk about are really interesting. They have a lot of ideas that were controversial in their time, and I think that remain controversial in the present as well. So I think it's interesting. Okay, I'm going to keep going on Durkheim. So, all right. He says, but what brings about the exceptional gravity of this state, he means the state of anomie, and I'll explain that in a second, nowadays particularly, is the heretofore unknown development that economic functions have experienced for about 2 centuries. So he's talking about after the Industrial Revolution. Whereas formerly they played only a secondary role, they are now of the first importance. We are far from the time when they were disdainfully abandoned to the inferior classes. In the face of the economic, the administrative, military, and religious functions become steadily less important. Only the scientific functions seem to dispute their place, and even science has scarcely any prestige, save to the extent that it can serve practical occupations, which are largely economic. So, I'm not familiar with social learning theory, John. I'm glad your mind is being blown, Liza. Okay, so what he's saying is it's kind of related to what Marx was saying. Although Durkheim is making the point differently. He's saying that previously you have these different parts of society of the law. You've got religion. Was the other thing that he said? The administrative, military, and religious functions become less important. Okay, so they become less important, and what becomes more important is economics and people being able to make money. And Durkheim doesn't have any problem with people wanting to make money. What he has a problem with is people, with there being no limits on how people can make money. He wants an economy that is interdependent, that has a division of labor, as it were. Okay, so part of the division of labor is, for Durkheim, is that we specialize. So like y'all are all in school. Part of your specialization is that you take classes and you pick a major. That makes you specialize. Your academic labor, your intellectual capacity is focused on a particular area, and then you will get a job in that particular area. So if you become a computer scientist or a sociologist or a psychologist or whatever, that means that you didn't become a mathematician or a physicist or a doctor or an engineer or whatever the case is. So without when you don't do those things, what you're basically saying is, I'm not a specialist in those things, so I need someone else to do those things. And so that's why, you go to a grocery store and if you don't know how to cook, you rely on grocery stores and restaurants to provide you with food. If you know how to cook, you can go to a grocery store and buy things that are raw and then cook them yourself. But so that's the way the entire economy works. That's Durkheim's argument. But it's also the way all of society works, because once we specialize, we become more interdependent. Okay. So this is really an absolutely crazy thing. I know in class, I'm always telling you, y'all matter, and how no one lives an insignificant life. And so I really grasped this coming from Durkheim. So here's how Durkheim would, I think, make the argument. He would say, since every single individual is part of almost an infinite number of social institutions and involved in different social groups and social mechanisms, there are both freedoms and duties that all of us have. And as we exercise those, we infringe and impede, but also help and empower other people. Okay. And all along, the way that we treat people, especially when we treat them with kindness and with respect, and we show them that they're important to us. We learn their names. We try to figure out what they want to do. We invest in them, and we show them that they're important to us. And so, because of that, since every single group has a lot of these individuals, and all the individuals are held together by this particular division of labor, no one is insignificant, because no one can be replaced. Does this make sense? Like that, there are no irreplaceable people. I guess this is a really interesting thing with COVID, right? Because we're not in the classroom anymore. But one of the things that I've kind of thought about is like, what is our class now? We're online, and we're talking. We're getting to do something similar to what we were doing in class. But I can't be the same digitally as I am in person. It's different to have me on a screen than actually standing in front of you. Whereas in class, I can come up to you and say, "Hey, come here. I need to talk to you. You said something in your paper that I'm concerned about, or that I thought was really excellent, or something like that." So that sense of interdependence, I'm not saying it necessarily goes away, but it changes. And so, yeah, obviously a huge part of my teaching is this idea that y'all are important, that what we're doing is important, that there's a right way to do it. And if one of the ways that we reach this conclusion is by seeing how we are all significant, and that our contributions are significant, and that the way that we pursue these things actually makes a humongous difference, and that the things that we study actually can change the world, and that we can change the world, and that we can make the whole thing a better place. And I got that idea straight out of Durkheim, from this idea of the division of labor. So, okay, hold on, John's going. Yes, John, exactly. I guess it's a lot like social learning theory. We definitely model ourselves off of people especially the people that we admire and that we want to be like. I'm sure all of you can think of role models that you have, and you have role models for all sorts of different reasons. I mean, sometimes because they're like us, they look like us or whatever. Sometimes because they're really, really excellent at something and we want to imitate their excellence. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes because we think people are super good, or they're just like really morally impressive people, and we want to imitate that as well, so we can become better. Or someone who's really wise, or someone who's really happy. We can look at that person's life and say, I think I would like to be more like that. So yeah, I think Durkheim would definitely jive with social learning theory. I wouldn't be surprised to find out, in fact, that the person who created that was influenced by him. All right, I'm going to go back to the text. All right, so I said earlier that Durkheim was talking about how society was changing after the Industrial Revolution, and that the way that it was structured and that its relations were becoming more about economics, and everything kind of was pushed to the foreground. And what's really interesting is, one of the arguments that we could make kind of against Durkheim is that a lot of the early people who were involved in industrialization were extremely religious. In fact, we'll talk about Max Weber on Friday, and he wrote a book called The Protestant Work Ethic, and the Spirit of Capitalism, and how these Protestant workers, basically because of their religious beliefs, saw earthly success as being kind of a signal that you were destined for salvation, and so they continued to work extremely hard and reinvest all their money in their business, and lived a very ascetic life. They didn't really have a lot of fun, and they weren't very indulgent, and so this meant that their businesses were extremely prosperous. So once you have basically a capitalist class that doesn't have these religious restrictions, these ways of treating people, these ways of behaving with your money, these terms of like being responsible and not wasteful, suddenly you have all sorts of kind of bad things that happen. And I think Durkheim has a good point. I don't know that he's necessarily totally correct on this, and so it's this part of his theory is not something that I've spent a ton of time arguing about, but I think he definitely has a point that when there aren't rules in place that force us to kind of halt and respect what's going on, then we tend to kind of just spin out of control. I mean, it's funny, right? Like our classroom, the way it's been functioning all semester is just there are two rules: be respectful, right, and no BS. And with those two rules, we're able to have discussions about things that are extremely unfashionable, that are very controversial, that are very difficult. But why are there only two rules? Because I figured when I started teaching that as long as there are some rules, students can understand what those rules are, understand why they're in place, and then following them helps, right? And I think y'all would all agree that has really worked out well for us. Okay, so here we go. Durkheim says, all right. All right, so he says, for precisely because the economic functions today concern the greatest number of citizens, there are a multitude of individuals whose lives are passed almost entirely in the industrial and commercial world. From this, it follows that as the world is only feebly ruled by morality, the greatest part of their existence takes place outside the moral sphere. So he's saying that, like, when you work in industry, when you work in this economic sector, think of like stock traders and Wall Street types. If that would probably make it the simplest way to see what he's talking about here. When your only goal is to make more and more and more money, and you're removed from the sense of morality, sense of duty and obligation that operates in other parts of society, then what happens is your life becomes increasingly unrestrained. Okay. All right. So he says, naturally, we are not inclined to thwart and restrain ourselves. If then we are not invited at each moment to exercise this restraint, without which there is no ethic, how can we learn the habit? If in the task that occupies almost all of our time we follow no other rule than that of our well-understood interest, how can we learn to depend upon disinterestedness, on self-forgetfulness, on sacrifice? In this way, the absence of all economic discipline cannot fail to extend its effects beyond the economic world and consequently weaken public morality. But the evil observed, what is its cause and what can be its remedy? So this is really interesting, right? He's saying that the more time we spend in this kind of unregulated sector, that we become more and more and more in the habit of not having restraints, of not learning to respect restraints. And so it's another thing that we've kind of talked about in class, right? Is having restraints on your particular life and what those things should look like and how they help you. So one of the things that we talked about in class, obviously, is getting enough rest. And so that requires discipline, doesn't it? Going to bed at a certain time, and you lay there, and even if you can't go to sleep, you need to be in the habit of trying to go to bed at a particular time, because as you know from being a little kid, having a bedtime is actually helpful. It means you know what you can look forward to. It means knowing how your day is supposed to end and at what time. And look at just pause and think for a second about how your life is different now during COVID-19, when suddenly we're not allowed to be around people. Every single time we're around them, we're supposed to be wearing a mask. How many of my hands are super dried out from how much hand sanitizer I've been using. You're not supposed to go to the grocery store. You're not supposed to go to the restaurant. A lot of us aren't getting paid. People are being fired left and right. We're not able to be in the classroom anymore. We're not allowed to spend time with people. I mean, it's just a humongous change in terms of our social relations. And so if you don't develop a routine in this humongous change, you can feel very alienated, very upset, very frustrated, and kind of drifty and aloof. So if you really want to be successful during this, you would be surprised how much better you would feel and how much better you would do if you got really disciplined. If you wrote out a schedule for yourself, you said, I'm going to wake up every day at this time, and I'm going to wake up and I'm going to have coffee, and I'm going to walk on the treadmill or walk around the block or whatever it is, and I'm going to work from this time, and I'm going to sit and watch this lecture, and I'm going to comment and whatever. And that sense of rhythm and of duty and of obligation, that will help you. And Durkheim was ahead of his time in noticing this. Okay, so now I can go back to page 1 because I've explained the economic stuff. So Durkheim starts the whole thing. He says, "We repeatedly insist in the course of this book upon the state of juridical and moral anomie, in which economic life actually is found. Indeed, in the economic order, occupational ethics exist only in the most rudimentary state. There is a professional ethic of the lawyer and the judge, the soldier and the priest, etc. But if one attempted to fix in a little more precise language the current ideas on what ought to be the relations of employer and employee, of worker and manager, of tradesmen and competition, to themselves or to the public, what indecisive formulas would be obtained." So for Durkheim, anomie is it's a term that he actually takes from a Latin translation of the Bible, and it has a really long and interesting history. Remember, the 2 books that he checked out more than anything else were Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Now, in Greek, anomos means lack of law, and in this case, what Durkheim is concerned with is the lack of moral law. Well, when the Bible is translated from Hebrew into Latin, St. Jerome translates every single instance of sin into anomia, right? And so sin, the Christian and Jewish understanding of sin, becomes is rendered in this Latin term. And so again, we cannot read Durkheim we cannot understand Durkheim if we forget that he's a rabbi. So again, he's saying that what we have now is this problem of juridical and moral sin, right? But again, even though he's coming from this religious background, he is not just talking at us like in terms of the way a theologian would, for example. He thinks that there is a social sin, and so he's secularizing these religious concepts, and he's bringing them to bear in the discussion of society. So what is moral anomie? It's when you have a lack of law, a lack of moral law, a lack of rules. One of the things I see more than anything else when I read reflection papers is how people are like, I come to college, I don't know who I am anymore. And then they go on to say that the things that they don't know about themselves, that they don't understand is, they used to go to church all the time and now they don't go anymore. Or they used to study all the time and now they don't study. Or they used to exercise all the time and now they don't exercise. Or they used to eat well all the time and now they don't eat well. Or they used to be really disciplined with their spending or whatever the case is. They used to have a lot of friends. They used to have a close friend group. They used to talk to their family all the time. Just a lot of stuff like that. And basically they come to college and they find out that that rule, right, those brackets that kind of insulated them, those are gone. And they find that they say basically that the reason that the brackets were in place was because of their family. And that's partially true, but it's also habit, right? Because you can go and you can have those same habits in college and take advantage of them. But without that kind of external authority, usually in the form of your family, or the social organizations that you're a part of, people tend not to behave in that way. Okay. So, yeah, it's really interesting stuff. Okay. The juridical anomie, he's talking about the spirit of the law. Durkheim was really influenced by Montesquieu and Rousseau, 2 guys who also Montesquieu at least influenced the founding fathers when they were writing the American Constitution. And so Durkheim talked about how when people don't understand the spirit of the law, then when they violate the law, the letter of the law, how it's written, And that's one thing. But when they write bad laws, or when laws are created that don't have the right kind of moral spirit, then all sorts of bad things can happen in society. So, okay. Again, he said with the moral anomie, the juridical anomie, that basically all these different professions that are prestigious professions, lawyer, judge, soldier, priest, right, whatever, that they don't have a particular ethic. And that's because, again, that ethic came from their particular place in society and their interdependence with other people, and the prestige, especially like if we think about religion, being a priest in a religion is a high ranking thing. Being a soldier in the army in a place like that values the military, that's a big deal. A lawyer, judge, and doctor, those are all prestigious professions. But even then, once you start having a more advanced society, with a bigger economy and more people, suddenly those people become paid wage laborers, like what Marx was saying. And once they start having to just try to earn money, and there's no professional ethic to talk about how people should behave, you start to find a lot of variation in the way that they can act. And it's really interesting to think about this because all of the major academic disciplines, sociology, psychology, biology, chemistry, whatever it is, they all have a wing that deals with the ethics within the discipline. And that's usually related to like research ethics. How can you study people in a way that is moral, that's ethical, and that's fair? Okay, and where the results of what is studied that come out, they're unbiased, they're trustworthy. And so some of the things that we're required to do in social science is we have to disclose where our funding comes from. We have to talk about if that funding gives us any sort of interested motive to kind of report the facts in a certain way. We have to talk about if we have to pass IRB, Institutional Review Board, especially if we're going to work with human subjects. We I guess those are the biggest ones. Our work goes through peer review. Therefore, like when we want to publish something, it goes it gets sent out for review, and then our fellow scholars review it, and they basically figure out if it's rigorous enough to be considered part of the literature in our discipline. And you can get rejected, you can get a revise and resubmit, you can get which is where you have to change some things and then they review it again. You can get conditional acceptance, like we want it, but make a couple of changes, or you can get outright accepted. So it's really interesting how all of these disciplines develop professional ethics. But Durkheim, when he was writing, those weren't there yet. They didn't come about yet. And so again, I want to be like really, really clear about this. Durkheim said that you needed that restraint, and he was curious what was going to fill in that vacuum, right? That moral vacuum that was created when religion lost its power. And so one of the things that we see nowadays is academics who are beholden. They're obliged to follow the rules created by our professional institutions. So, for what it's worth. Okay, one more thing, and then I think we're done. Okay. Oh, he says, "Is this anomic state that is the cause, as we shall show, of the incessantly recurring conflicts and the multifarious disorder of which the economic world exhibits so sad a spectacle. For as nothing restrains the active forces and assigns them limits they are bound to respect, they tend to develop haphazardly and come into collision with one another, battling and weakening themselves. To be sure, the strongest succeed in completely demolishing the weakest or in subordinating them. But if the conquered, for a time, must suffer subordination under compulsion, they do not consent to it, and consequently this cannot constitute a stable equilibrium." In other words, economic actors working and basically duking it out. The strongest still wins, and then they're kind of under the thumb of the people who won a particular battle. Think of all the lawsuits and the copyright law lawsuits, and Apple suing anyone who creates it looks anything like their stuff, and Android doing the same thing, and people getting into all sorts of fights about their trademarks and their products and stuff like that. And how if you're from like a small company, you don't have the same legal resources as these big firms do to fight a long, drawn out legal battle. Okay. He says, truces arrived at after violence are never anything but provisional and satisfy no one. Human passions stop only before a moral power they respect. If all authority of this kind is wanting, the law of the strongest prevails, and latent or active, the state of war is necessarily chronic. So this sounds a lot like Thomas Hobbes in his book, famous book, Leviathan, where he talks about the state of nature as being a war of all against all, where everyone's fighting everyone, basically. And so, but Durkheim's making kind of a slightly different point because he says that society mitigates the war of all against all unless society's rules make it so that the war of all against all either is allowed to continue or, this is worse, or is intensified. So, some of the things that we talked about earlier, like how no one lives an insignificant life. One of the things I said in class previously was, am I the first person to tell you this? And if so, why is that the case? How come I, John, in 2020 in college, in a freshman class, am the first person to tell you that no one lives an insignificant life? And in fact, might be the first person to try to make that argument as something that you can really, really hold on to and build your life around. So that's kind of worrisome to me, right? Because you have kids growing up in this world, and you were a kid just a short time ago, and to have grown up from adolescence not realizing that you are significant, that your life makes a difference, and that your choices make a difference, and they make a difference not only for you but for other people, and the way we're able to completely change a person's day, for example, just in the way that we treat them. We treat them with kindness, we treat them with respect. When we disagree with them, there is a nice way to do that. There is a civil way to do that, where we don't have to make them feel like a horrible person simply because they don't agree with us. But this isn't easy, and so Durkheim would say it's not easy at all. So we need restraints. We need particular rules that kind of force us to check our passions, force us to check ourselves, so that we can see the person across from us as a human being, as someone with dignity, as someone worthy of our respect, and to kind of go from there. So that's all on Durkheim today. I guess I'll sit here for a second. Do you have any questions? I said a lot. All right, I'll wait a second. Oh, yes. Go ahead, John. He being Durkheim? Okay. What else does it go back to? Hi, Bisque. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point, John. It's extremely complicated, right? Because a lot of the way that we treat other people has to do with how we treat ourselves. And if we see ourselves as intrinsically unworthy, it's hard to see how we would be able to see other people as being worthy as well. Or we can see ourselves as unworthy and everyone else as worthy, which is a whole nother problem. So I think Durkheim kind of steps in it on that issue. But I think here's what he would say. He would say society's obligation is to make you to make you see that your life is significant and that other people's lives are significant, that you are worthy and that they are worthy, that while you are unworthy, for example, for whatever reason, that they're unworthy for other reasons. And we can't know what that is because, again, part of that is our psychology and part of that is what it is to be a person. And to that end, part of Durkheim saying that we're limitless, that our nature kind of just can continue to go and go and go, is that there are no bounds on something like self hatred, for example. And so he sees that as another obligation of society, is that it is supposed to set moral limits on how we are supposed to treat not only other people but how we treat ourselves. Okay. That's extremely profound. That's a really profound idea, and I think it's really clear from that it's another example of the rabbi kind of shining through. So what's one last thing about that is Durkheim eventually got this really, really important position at a French university, and he was in charge of he was the only teacher at the school who taught every single incoming freshman, every single one. And so part of that school's job was training the next generation of teachers in France. And so you can imagine how much power he had as the only teacher who was going to teach all the future teachers of France. Okay. And one of the things he used to tell his students is, never forget I am the son of a rabbi. I mean, that is just, it's so awesome. Okay. Like it's so cool. Okay. So part of that is his insistence on the division of labor as this profound social force that operates all the way down to the cellular level to make disparate parts work together. And then he takes that idea and he goes all the way up the chain from there, so that he says that all of us who exist, right, and all of us who have existed before, we all live an interdependent life. Therefore, no one is insignificant. And that idea of the division of labor being a force that kind of pushes people and but also pulls them back into relation with one another sounds a lot like the Force from Star Wars. And I'm not the first person to think this, because the Arthur Schopenhauer, who I mentioned earlier, who influenced Durkheim, had this idea of the will, and all of his writings got digested through a guy named Joseph Campbell. Okay, and George Lucas read Joseph Campbell, and he read Jung, and he read Schopenhauer. And through those three things, he basically put together this idea of the will. And in one of Schopenhauer's books, one of the things that he argues is that it sounds like we should call the will a force because of its ability to push and propel and pull things back. So it's pretty interesting that he spends a lot of time even talking about the particular words that he's using in his philosophy. And then, oh, by the way, when Lucas puts the whole thing together, he calls that force, or that will, he calls it the force. So basically, he just takes Schopenhauer's idea and he says, no, I think I actually am going to call it the force. And that is the great, it's the energy in everything that holds the universe together, that allows it to develop, that allows it to kind of come together and make everything significant. So, yeah, I could talk about this forever. This is one of my absolute favorite things to talk about in sociology. I think it's pretty easy to see how this comes out in our class and why how it's interrelated to a lot of the things that I talked about. But I'll leave it there for today. So Friday, we're going to talk about Max Weber. It looks like Weber. It's pronounced Weber. And we're going to read his piece of one of his works. I think it's called On the Types of Legitimate Authority. So a really, really interesting piece to be sure. So that's all for me, guys. I hope y'all are having a really good Wednesday, and I look forward to talking to you on Friday. Again, if you have any questions about nation states or anything else going on, shoot me an email, leave a comment on the video, whatever. And again, stay out of this mess. Follow the social distancing and develop a routine, because that will really help you. And it's these are strange times that we're in. It's okay to say that. It's okay to feel uncertain about that. So that's all for me, and I'll see you all on Friday. Thanks for being attentive, y'all.
Thanks.